Throughout these proceedings, you've been a very vocal advocate for including human rights and women's rights language in the agreement. Do you worry at all that by pushing so hard for that, that we jeopardize a broader climate agreement because certain countries might not want to sign on?
No, I think it becomes even more important as we're seeing an ambition, which I appreciate, in the discussions. I see more openness now to talking about striving to reach 1.5, not just 2 degrees. That means we will have to accelerate getting out of fossil fuel. It means we'll have to be more urgent in the measures. It also means that we could make a lot of mistakes in climate policy, like land grabs and just doing things that poor people will be very affected by. So the putting, as it is in the moment, in Article 2.2 and also in the preamble, having it in the operative part, respect human rights and promote gender equality, is a vital part of how we do it. It's what the heads of state said on the 30th of November when they came. The messages were very, very similar from all the heads of state. This is for humanity, and we must remember those who are most affected and least responsible.
So how would a push to be even more aggressive, to get to 1.5, how would that make these issues that you're talking about more urgent?
Well, if we want to be at or near 1.5, that means we have to get out of carbon by 2050 at the latest. We probably won't see that explicitly in the text, but we will see language that is more open to the 1.5. And then we will need reviews every 5 years, as people have been saying, hopefully starting before 2020, of the INDCs, the commitments that governments have made, because we will need to increase the ambition.
So in a climate context and looking at countries sort of trying to figure out how to change their energy mix and going forward, what are the concrete steps that they need to take to keep human and women's rights in mind?
I think they just have to realize that having a consciousness of the values of protecting human rights and the fact that there's a very strong gender dimension to climate informs good climate policy. We've made mistakes in the past. We've used corn for ethanol and driven up food prices. It wasn't a good decision. We've built dams and completely undermined poor land rights of very poor people. So I think we just need to know that this will inform good climate policy. And the language that is there doesn't create new rights. It just remembers that the values of the United Nations are the values of the Universal Declaration, which after all was signed here in Paris in 1948.
So are there places in the world that you've seen progress, where you've seen a kind of twinning of climate justice and sort of human and gender justice?
What I have seen is that more and more people are talking in terms of climate justice. When President Hollande opened the session on the 30th of November, he said we must have climate justice, and so did many other leaders. And it's part of the whole civil society, and it's increasingly part of the B team, for example, business leaders, which I'm linked to as an honorary member of the B team, also are committed to climate justice. So what I'm seeing is the injustice of the impacts of climate change have made an impact. We now know that climate change is not something of the future, that there are millions of people who are suffering in their daily life, who suffer because the rainy seasons don't come as predicted, who suffer because of long periods of drought and flash flooding, who suffer because of cyclones. And we have small island states who've been making the case. Unless we are striving for 1.5, we go under. Now, when Eleanor Roosevelt was presiding over a commission on human rights for the Universal Declaration, they never imagined that human activity could cause whole countries to go out of existence. So there has been an awareness of that human side. And of course, one of the things that we really need to do is make sure that as we move forward, especially in access to energy, that no one is left behind.
So how do we do that?
I think we have to realize that the Industrial Revolution left a lot of people behind. And even the Millennium Development Goals left a lot of people behind. So we still have 1.2, 1.3 billion 17% of our world with no access to electricity, and 2.6 billion who cook on open fires and have terrible health problems, and mostly women, of course. I think we need to reach them insofar as possible from a market point of view, with social entrepreneurs, with even business case reaching them, and there are a lot of very good examples. But there are those below the market. And my foundation has been encouraging the use of the social protection systems that exist in many countries. Let me give you an example in Malawi. I was in Malawi in 2012. I spoke to government officials there, and they have linked access to clean cook stoves with their social transfer system. This year, they'll reach a modest number, 4,800, and they're reaching them. Next year, they predict 230,000, and by 2020, 2 million. Now, if we want to reach numbers of very poor people, we can do it. We even have the mobile phone technology for tiny payments now. We have the gadgets, and we have the method of payment. And yet, you know, I was shocked when I read the outlook for Africa of the International Energy Agency, because it said by 2040, there would still be 530 million people in Africa with no access to electricity, more than 500 million. That's an outlook on current trends, and that's why current trends are not acceptable. We cannot have business as usual.
So how do we shift that? Is it just a matter of sort of will, or what are the other things that it takes?
I quite honestly, I'm optimistic. I think it is absolutely shifting. And I think there are very good things happening about access to energy, for example, in Africa. And of course, this also applies to South Asia. But, you know, the clean energy for Africa is really on the move now. What I also want, because it's important, is that there will be responsible investing, that the Ruggie principles of business and human rights are really in the forefront, that companies have the environmental, social and governance principles, because when a market opens up suddenly, as Africa on energy is opening up, people can cut corners and it can be bad on the ground. So we need those principles.
Okay. Well, since we're talking a little bit about the financing and how we pay for that, I'd like to invite our economist to join us, Nicholas Stern.
He's pretty good on social justice too. On
so I hear.
Justice.
Please welcome him. All right. Lord Stern is the I.G. Patel Professor of Economics and Government and Chair at the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the London School of Economics. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Hello.
So you've heard what we've been discussing, and I think one of the issues that often comes up when we talk about climate justice is how do you pay for it? It's often seen as very expensive. So tell us how you see the economics situation in terms of moving this kind of thing forward.
If I could give you a big story, but also some examples from a country where I've been working for 40 years in India. The big picture is that we now see that we can have better growth, better climate. And indeed, that if we look at the two defining challenges of our century, which are overcoming poverty and managing climate change, it's clear that if we fail on one, we fail on the other. I think that's a huge change over the last 7 or 8 years. A lot of the discussions here are set up around an artificial horse race between growth on the one hand and climate responsibility on the other, and it's fake. And we have to show that, and we can see it much more clearly now, partly because the cost of doing things differently has come down extraordinarily. Probably the cost of a solar PV panel in the last decade has come down by a factor of 10. You see the difference between incandescent light bulbs and LED light bulbs. Enormous, enormous change. So we see now how we can do it much more clearly, and we also see that this is enormously urgent in the sense that we have about 3 billion people moving into our cities in the next 35 years or so, from around 3.5 billion to around 6.5 billion. This is a once-in-a-history move. Once in history, not just once in a century, it's once in a history move. And the infrastructure that we build for those cities will determine not only whether we can breathe and move in those cities, but also the future of carbon emissions and whether we successfully manage climate change. So we can see these enormous opportunities arising from this particular period. We can see the enormous opportunities arising from the very rapid change in technology. So we can now see that this is a story of better growth and better climate at the same time.
And no one left behind.
And no one left behind. And I've told you a big picture story. Let me tell you a much smaller picture story. As I say, I've been living and working in India for more than 40 years. And good friend, Harish Hande, runs Selco, where they bring microfinance and solar panels to people running stores in small towns, to small villages, to schools, and so on. They've now reached about 200,000 people, and it transforms lives. And on Mary's point, not managing climate change violates human rights of people because of the damage it does. But actually doing the change in the right way delivers human rights. For example, Harish Hande's group puts solar chargers in schools, and then you get very lightweight batteries which the children can bring, and they can charge it up whilst they're in schools. Very cheap things. And they take it home, there's an LED light bulb, and they can study in the evening. That delivers the human right to education. It can relieve, it can give you, these kinds of things can give you much better cooking inside the house or the hut, as Mary has described. That's delivering on a human right to health. So the way you do it, it's not just the consequences violate human rights, it's the way you do it deliver on human rights. And all this has been built up in the last 10, 20 years in a remarkable way. Interestingly, it hasn't yet enough changed the debates of these negotiators who sometimes are a bit locked in to their old ways of understanding, and they see this fake trade-off as being important when it's actually diversionary.
So where does the capital, though, come from to try to take advantage of some of these opportunities, as you call them?
That's extremely important. I've given the idea of microfinance, which is what Harish Hande does. Very interesting example also, Grameen Shakti in Bangladesh, one of Mohammed Yunus's enterprise. They've reached 1 million people already. So microfinance is one part of the story, where you need some support for the ability to borrow and then to relend, and I think we should see more of the international financial institutions behind that. But at the big level, what we've got is a world that's awash with savings, a world that's got enormous investment opportunities, but policies are not yet of a kind that translate those investment opportunities into real investment demand. That's an absolutely key big story. But there is no shortage of savings in the world. There's a shortage of good investment projects, but lots of good investment opportunities. The challenge is good policy to clear, predictable, for example, price of carbon, clear, predictable rules, for example, the phasing out of incandescent light bulbs. I think feed-in tariffs managed well, they can be managed badly like anything else, but feed-in tariffs managed well, that gives the kind of confidence you need to change an investment opportunity into investment demand. And that brings down the cost of capital. There are many places borrowing at 8 or 9% real, when actually for governments they borrow at next to nothing. If you can translate, or through good policies, and you need much more from the international financial institutions and the local development banks, if you can change that 8 or 9% real down to 3 or 4% real, well, you transform the competitiveness of many renewables because they're well over half capital cost. If you've got something that's well over half capital cost, you cut the cost of capital by half, you're reducing the overall cost by 25, 30% just in one go.
Right.
Could I just add one point to what Nick is saying? We are asking developing countries to develop without emissions, if possible, to go as quickly as possible into renewables, to actually leapfrog through renewables into their development, and they have a right to develop. They can't do it without finance and transfer of technology. I mean, that's one of the key issues that's being discussed in the talks at the moment at Le Bourget. And, you know, the challenge for developing countries is very big, and they are saying that. But we need a solidarity of being willing to provide that finance and technology because it's in our interests, because we need to get to, strive to 1.5, and that's going to be tough.
Right, but that would take, when you speak of policies, that would take certain policies within those countries to make that investment de-risked, so to speak.
Exactly.
Right.
You can't, certainty is not on offer in the world, but reduced uncertainty is on offer, and government-induced policy risk is the biggest deterrent to investment around the world, whether it's in my own country or Europe more generally, or in India or Africa. Government-induced policy risk is a fundamental deterrent, and there's lots we can do to reduce that risk. But let's be clear, the world is awash with savings. This is about getting smart, much more smart about policies that govern the investment demand around, as I mentioned, feed-in tariffs, however you do it. But at the same time, you've got to act directly on the way in which the capital comes itself.
Okay. On that note, I'd like to invite Dana Younger to join us. Dana is a renewable energy specialist who has got his own soundtrack. So he's a renewable energy specialist at the International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank, and he's been very engaged in this kind of work in these parts of the world. So Dana, maybe you can talk a little bit about, number one, why are there still 1.3 billion people without access to electricity in the developing world, and how on the ground is that beginning to change?
Thank you, Diane, and thanks also for the invitation to be here. This has been a very stimulating couple of days. First off, I think in terms of understanding the magnitude of the problem and the difficulty of addressing it, there's 2 billion people either without access to electricity or with unreliable access or inadequate access. And most of them are in rural areas of the world, very low density. Essentially, utilities don't make money typically serving those populations. And it's also very costly to string line to extend the grid to interconnect those kinds of populations. And I think one of the things that's been happening that we haven't really focused on here in this discussion is the limitations of the governments in these countries to address that problem. And even with all the capital that the World Bank Group and the international financial institutions are devoting to this problem, it's really only been a drop in the bucket. Because if you look at what it's going to take to electrify these people, you're talking about a quantum of capital being spent every year of something between $20 and $50 billion. Today, to do electricity production improvements in these countries, the international financial institutions are spending about $3.4 billion per annum. And you're only getting something like 1.4 million connections. So you're really just not reaching it. So we really need a quantum leap. And this is really what the Sustainable Energy for All program that the UN Secretary General started in 2011 is all about. And many of the technological changes that we've talked about are now enabling this, together with new business models and improved flow in private capital. So just as an example, LEDs, which you mentioned, Nick, they've gone through a 10,000% improvement in efficiency since the year 2000. And the costs have gone down 90%. Battery technologies improved in efficiency 168% since 2000. We've heard about the rapid decline in the cost of solar PV. So when you start combining these, suddenly you have the possibility to have, for example, solar lanterns being sold at a very affordable price to displace kerosene. And the kerosene market, which is also a very noxious product for a lot of these countries where you're using them in enclosed spaces and causing a lot of health problems, particularly for young children trying to read at night and women trying to prepare food and so forth, needs to be replaced with something cleaner. So suddenly you have products being offered by many different suppliers that can address that market. Then as you move up the scale, up the energy ladder, so to speak, you begin to have the possibility for solar home systems. And we have many new entrants coming into that space, again, because of the economics and the many more light points that can be offered when you use LEDs rather than CFLs, and being able to have other kinds of appliances supported with those systems, and then up to microgrids and mini grids and on up. So it's really, there's been really almost a revolution going on over the last 5 to 7 years in this area.
So does that, all of those changes taken together, you know, the advances in technology, the bringing down of the price, creating investment opportunities, is it realistic to actually think about the idea that in the developing world, people could actually leapfrog and not even bother building a huge, central power station, long transmission line system like we've done, and do sort of like what's happened with cell phones, right? How feasible is that really?
Yeah, it's enormously feasible. In the next 20 years, given the processes of growth in the developing world, which we should welcome and embrace and foster, and given the move into cities, given how many people will be moving through income levels where the demand for energy goes up very quickly, high income elasticity of demand in the jargon of my profession, we will be building in the next 20 years probably more capital, infrastructure capital, than exists now. All. It is incredibly, we mustn't ever lose track of how important this next 20 years is. But that really answers your question, because how we build that infrastructure is absolutely fundamental. And we now have choices that probably 20 years ago we did not have, because things have changed. But it's not just the technology. We have to get much smarter about how we build our cities. We have to build Barcelonas, not Atlantas. Yeah? That's the kind of, I apologize to anybody from Atlanta, but it's an example of a very sprawled out city which uses enormous, about 10 times amount of energy and CO2 emissions for transportation than Barcelona. We know a lot about how to do things. We know a lot more about how to change existing cities that don't function terribly well. So we have that choice, but it's this next 20 years. If we dawdle, a lot of that infrastructure will be built in the bad old ways and we'll be in deep, deep trouble. And sometimes people don't understand clearly enough the magnitude of the opportunity of next 20 years, but also the deep responsibility. If we get this wrong, it's our children and grandchildren who will be in deep... I had a little bet with Mary.
We mentioned the grandchildren first.
I did, okay. But this 20 years is fundamental, but it is the answer to your question.
Okay.
If I could chime in on that as well, just looking at a lot of the key parts of the developing world that are most affected by this, particularly sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where the predominant number of these unserved or underserved populations exist. These solutions are now occurring, and they're being done at a reasonable scale for the first time, and I would say probably for the first time with adequate capitalization. Very interesting announcement actually here. Enel Green Power, we had Francesco Stracci on an earlier panel, just announced this week that they're acquiring a 10,000 customer system being installed by a startup out of San Francisco called PowerHive, which also has First Solar as an investor and Caterpillar as an investor, and a number of social investment funds and family foundations in the equity. Acciona, who's one of the sponsors of this event, has a separate microenergia foundation doing this in the Americas, in places like Peru where you have underserved populations. And I could go on and on with examples. I think what's changed is that there's both the technological opportunity, the experimentation and proof of the business model. So with the mobile cash from places like M-Pesa and others, Bartel, Bharti Airtel money, that's created an enormous form of banking and electronic funds transfer, which enables the small payments that, and actually the pay-as-you-go form of sales, as opposed to cash sales, is exploding exponentially. So that's what I think is going to drive the further expansion of these kinds of systems and create the kind of technological leapfrogging that we all hope will occur.
In many ways, I just wanted to make that point because we hadn't made it to date. And when you think the very poor people with very small incomes pay too much for the kerosene and candles, and they have to miss a payment if a child is sick or the house is flooded or whatever happens. So they need to be able to pay in very small amounts. And now we have these apps, we have these methods of payment, and we will be able to enable families to have the light, clinics to have light for safe births, schools to have lights, because the method of payment is there now with apps, with mini payments. And I think that will revolutionize. And I just really feel we have to bear in mind that figure in the International Energy Agency's report, that by 2040, 10 years after the Sustainable Energy for All, there could be 500 million people in Africa with no access to electricity. And that's the business as usual model, which is changing. I think it's going to change very fast in Africa and South Asia, and for the better.
Can I add another micro? Sometimes the economists talk big picture stuff, but to add another micro story, I mean, many of you who've lived in India or Africa or wherever know the power of the people who run the grid over your life. So your grid connection, it's happened to me, it probably happened to a number of people in this room, your grid connection goes off, they let you wait for a while and get really steamy, and then somebody knocks on the door and says, I'm sorry, there's a disconnect here, and you ask them, well, how long will it be? They say, well, it might be another 2 or 3 days. And then your heart sort of sinks, and then the gentleman, it nearly always is a man, goes down to the end of the path or whatever, down corridor, and on the way out says, but my cousin works in the electricity company and I see what I can do. And that is the kind of thing shows that if you supply people off-grid, you empower them, you avoid them being, they've got to be crude, they've got their hands on your switch. And that is an example of another way in which you empower people through these kinds of things by giving them control over their own lives. In the village where I've been working for 40 years, people steal wires. So the grid goes down because the wire is worth something. So we have to recognize that there are all kinds of greater certainties in your life. If you control that power, you're more resilient actually against floods and storms. It's a way that it shows that mitigation, adaptation and development, they come together, they're intertwined, and we make a mistake if we try to pull them apart. There's so many examples, but decentralized solar is one of them.
And in a way, it's the other side of climate justice, because you're dealing with the injustice. So these are the very people most affected at the moment and least able to be resilient and to adapt. And by giving them access to clean energy, you change their lives, you help them to bring themselves out of the deep poverty that they're in and make them more resilient. And I think, I think it is important that we see climate justice as also access to the benefits of climate change. I mean, the benefits of clean energy.
If I could just also provide a couple of anecdotes. You talked earlier, Nick, about Selco and Harish Handi and his work. Don't lose sight of the fact that the applications that are being used by the customers of these kinds of companies are really transforming their lives. He often gives the example of midwives being able to properly do their work by light at night, or if somebody has a small business, whether it's a tailor or somebody else making some kind of a product, that they can be much more productive as a result. So there's a real economic development impact, which we know from the important role that electricity plays in all the highly industrialized economies. It was fascinating. I was in Patna, which is the capital of Bihar, just several weeks ago, and IFC was running a global lighting or Lighting Asia event for the marketers of solar lanterns. Many of the companies you may have heard of, D-Light, Barefoot Power, Orb Energy, and so forth, and some very large players like Panasonic and Total. And fascinating to me, I went up and talked to the Total guy who was there. He was the head of downstream products from Mumbai, and I said, what are you doing here? And he said, well, this is a very important initiative of our company, and I want to make sure that the signal is being sent to the people involved with this, that this is important to the company, and we really want to make a go of this. So it's fascinating, the way in which major corporate players, whether it's a First Solar, whether it's a SunPower, Total, whoever, are really driving into this business in a significant way.
Okay, great. This is great. I just want to make sure that we give the audience a chance to ask a question or two, if there are any, from the floor. Over here.
Thank you. I'm very happy that Mariana Heinrich from the WBCSD, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. I'm very happy that Mr. Younger mentioned PowerHive and First Solar there as the sort of first movers. Now, we are having a working group of 10 companies, of which First Solar is actually part, to really look at how can we make business being more active in the microgrid space, because 1.3 billion or 2 billion people, that's not going to happen by government money. Right. And one of the things that we're hearing most often from these companies is that the reason why they can't move forward is not economics, is not technology, it's policy, because there is no micro of good legal framework in those countries existing, and that ultimately hinders finance. So is there anything, like, you haven't really touched on the policy side there. Is there like anything you can add to that?
Sure. No, I'd be happy to take that on, and maybe Nick may also want to add. You're absolutely spot on, and actually I had discussions with Chris Horner, the CEO of PowerHive, when they were first a startup, and even before the First Solar investment was made, and that was one of the points that I made to him, was that we learned a lot through our financing of solar home system operators back in the late 1980s and 1990s. And one was that if you don't have a durable concession, your business model is subject to being completely undermined, whether it's by a politician who says, I'm going to run wire to this village before an election, or if it just was kind of creeping conversion or urbanization or other forces. So one of the companies we financed in Latin America, Luz Dominicana and Luz in Honduras, was facing that very real problem. So they actually were able to negotiate, PowerHive in this case, a durable agreement with the government of Kenya and KPLC, the local utility, to have the right to operate in certain parts of the country for a considerable time period. And that's increasing. I know in Nigeria, the Federal Ministry of Power has just acknowledged we can't reach all the unelectrified parts of Nigeria. And so effectively they're opening up a new market, but we also do have to be concerned about regulation in that market, because equally there can be a downside to this where you have unscrupulous operators, you have defective equipment, and other kinds of problems that can and will exist. In fact, a lot of the global lighting and Lighting Africa and Lighting Asia initiatives are all around quality standards and quality products. And I had a very high UN official come to me and tell me a personal story about him buying, when he was in China, solar lanterns that he took back to his family. I'm not going to name what country or what official, and they didn't work. And so that's an enormously damaging effect on the market. So you have to set quality standards and produce, high quality equipment in order to drive the business models ahead.
And sometimes NGOs can help in that process. I don't want to overdo my examples from Bangalore, but that's where I lived for a while. And they had the Bangalore scorecard system, where it was set up, as a bottom-up process, but where people living there scored the service that they got from the water or the bus company or the electricity company. And that kind of information and transparency can put quite a lot of pressure on performance. So sometimes that could lead to legal change or administrative change, but sometimes it leads to behavioral changes of the utilities, because embarrassment is a very powerful weapon.
I mentioned at the start the importance of responsible investing at all sides, but the point I really wanted to make is I also see a political will in Africa now. The president of Benin has said he wants every citizen in his country to have access to light, electric light, and he's given a time span for that. The same thing is happening in Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya. I mean, I think there's a real mind shift also.
India also.
And in the African Development Bank, the new head of the African Development Bank, former Minister of Agriculture of Nigeria, he is focused on energy, both top-down and, I'm glad to say, bottom-up. and he has a special fund for the bottom up. So I think we'll get more both regulatory access and taking out the risk, which is very important.
Great. Well, I want to thank you all for your time this morning. This has been a very inspiring conversation. I'm afraid we have to end here.
Okay.
I would like to hand things over
to
my colleague, Charles Duhigg, for the last sessions of the day.
Okay, thank you.